Should you do explosive work before or after strength work? Stay tuned to find out. What's up, guys? Enkiri here, and today I want to talk a little bit about sequencing of explosive work and strength work within a training session. And before we get started here, if you guys could please help the channel out by hitting the like button. The engagement there is really helpful for me, and I really appreciate the support as well. Now let's get into it. So I get asked very often how you should order these different types of exercises in your training session, your explosive work and your strength work, because a lot of people have actually seen me do explosive work after I do my heavy work for the day. And so the answer really is that it depends on a lot of different factors. And today what I want to kind of do is break down a couple of the major scenarios that I have encountered and hopefully arm you guys with a little bit more knowledge to make better decisions in your programming when it comes to explosive work versus standard strength work. So the general kind of age-old advice typically goes something like this. Explosive work should be done first when you're the freshest and the sharpest and the most capable of completing those explosive efforts crisply. And then strength work should follow the explosive work, right? So for example, a typical sequencing in a training session would go something like unloaded explosive work first, right? So that would be your jumps and your sprints, anything where you're being explosive, essentially moving your own body weight. And that's how you would kick the session off. Then you would move into the loaded explosive work. So now you're talking about things like weighted jumps or maybe Olympic lifts, kettlebell swings, other things of that sort. And then you would finish with the strength work after that. So now you're talking about your traditional exercises like squats or pulls or deadlifts, RDLs, anything like that, right? And this is kind of the traditional, typical way that it is recommended that you sequence the exercises within a training session. And in general, this is pretty solid advice, right? It's solid, but it is not set in stone. And there are certainly instances where you may actually want to tweak the order of operations within this framework. So for example, when I was younger, one thing that I started doing was I would actually squat heavy as the very first thing in my training session. I would kick the training session off with a heavy squat, and then I would do some Olympic lifting work after the heavy squat segment. And then after that, I would finish up with a little bit of volume work on the squat. So I ended up breaking up the squat work into two separate pieces. And I did this because I wanted to get good at the Olympic lifts, but I also wanted to emphasize my squatting first and foremost. I wanted to build stronger legs with the squat first and foremost. And what I kind of ended up discovering inadvertently was that once I got acclimated to doing it this way, the Olympic lifts didn't really suffer either, right? Even though I had squatted heavy first, I was still able to perform very well on the Olympic lifts as well. So I can say that I kind of inadvertently discovered breaking the mold here, for lack of a better way to put it, and it really worked very well for me at the time. Now these days, I can really go either way with it, where I start with something explosive or where I start with something heavy. Mostly what I actually end up, the way I kind of base it on how I'm going to do it really depends on what the volume of the program's strength work looks like versus what the volume of the program explosive work looks like. So unless you're going really high volume with the jumping or the sprinting, or you're working into high levels of fatigue rather than focusing on explosive performance, those exercises, those types of exercises, they don't really tend to burn you out, right? Instead, they can actually charge you up, which is part of the reason why it's generally recommended that you do them first, right? So jumping or sprinting doesn't typically detract from squatting once you're acclimated to jumping and sprinting. But squatting can certainly detract from jumping and sprinting if the volume is high, but not necessarily if the volume is low. So one thing that I'm liking to do right now, and that I kind of picked up on from that inadvertent discovery that I made all those years ago when I started doing Olympic lifts, is that I'm squatting heavy the very first thing in my training session right now. Since my current programming is conjugate style, the heavy work And the volume work on my leg exercises, I can split those up by using separate variations, right? So I can work up to one thing for a heavy squat, and then I can change exercises altogether. Right now, what I'm doing is a unilateral exercise, and I can get my volume work for my legs in that way, right? So on my heavy squat, I'm just working my way up to a heavy single on whatever the squat variation is for that day. The volume is very low there because of that, and I'm also well acclimated to this type of work at this point. So it's really not very draining for me at all. So I can go out, I can kick things off with that heavy squat, and then right after that, I'm actually able to go out and perform super explosive sprinting and jumping variations at a very high level of performance. And then once I'm done with that explosive work, whatever it is that's planned for that day, that's when I move on to that volume work for the legs. So again, right now it's something like a split squat or a pistol squat or something like that. This is also when I add in the things like the hinge work, glute ham raises, hip flexor exercises, etc., etc. So I have tweaked the traditional sequencing that I talked about at the beginning of the video just a little bit, right? To where the heavy work comes very first in the training session, the explosive work comes second, and then the volume work comes last, right? As opposed to the explosive work comes first, the heavy work comes second, and then the volume work comes third. It's heavy first, explosive second, then volume. Now, in general, the volume work always has to come last because it is going to be too fatiguing, right? When you're doing a high volume of work, even if the weight is light, even if the intensity is low, when the reps are high, you are burning yourself out. You're producing a lot of waste products, that lactic acid, the burning in the legs, and that's what's going to make it to where you can't perform well on heavy work or on explosive work. So the volume work is what comes last because basically it kind of ruins everything else that comes after it. But once you're acclimated to all these different types of work, right? The heavy leg work and the explosive work, doing the heavy leg work can certainly come before doing the explosive work with little detriment to the explosive work and vice versa as well. Even though the former scenario kind of goes against the grain, kind of goes against the traditional recommendations that are typically touted, right? Now there is going to be some personal preference involved here and some trial and error involved as well. There always is, right? Some people may simply find that jumping and sprinting feels better after the nervous system has been kicked into overdrive by a little bit of heavy work. I'm one of these people. It's kind of the classic post-activation potentiation effect, right? Whereas other people may find that the inverse actually rings more true, where jolting the nervous system with maximal explosive efforts, jumping, sprinting, etc., makes the heavy work feel stronger and smoother and better. And as I've alluded to, for me, I kind of like the former option more so these days. My hips and knees are ready to go after just a few minutes of easy mobility work, right? After I've done just 5 or less than 5 minutes, I've talked about this in recent history. After I've done just a few minutes of mobility work, I'm ready to go with my squatting, and I can easily work my way up to a heavy squat single after just about 20 or so minutes in the gym. And then after that heavy single, it becomes a seamless transition into the jump work and the sprint work for me because the nervous system is already kicked into high gear and the applicable joints are warmed up and ready for those high intensity explosive efforts. So after that, after I've done my heavy squat, all I give myself 2 easy, what I call primer sets on whatever explosive exercise that I'm doing that day. And then after that, I'm ready to rock. I'm straight into my working set. So it really cuts out a lot of the fluff for me, right? And a lot of the need to warm up and ramp up and all that shit, which can sometimes be tedious and time consuming on these types of activities where you're constantly dancing a fine line between warming up the body while also trying not to get tired in the process, while also still being sure to progressively kick the nervous system into action as well. So you're really towing the line as you attempt to achieve high level performance. Other factors to consider are the actual exercises that will be performed that day. For example, sprinting and jumping they're both technical to an extent, but in reality, they're not really technical at all, right? Those activities are basically as technical as you want them to be. And if you're just going balls out, you're basically getting the training effect that we're looking for, almost regardless of technique, unless you are a competitive sprinter or something like that, right? So doing those exercises after a little bit of heavy work, probably not really a big deal at all. And same kind of deal with loaded jumps. It's just a brute, heave-ho, aggressive as you can go type of exercise. But it's really once you start getting into multi-sequence types of explosive activities, or things like longer distance shuttle drills where the constant stop-start action is very fatiguing in and of itself. Or if you're talking about things like Olympic lifts as opposed to, say, loaded jumps, where now it's kind of like, okay, most of these activities are highly technical. The small amounts of fatigue that accrue become actually more important in these activities compared to the more brute force ones. So with these, it's probably better to stick with the traditional sequencing that I talked about in the beginning of the video, where the explosive stuff comes first in the workout, just because, again, these exercises are generally more technical, and so they're probably better served when they're done in the freshest state possible. Lastly, you also have to consider what your goals are at the time. Sequencing things in a certain way may make some exercises feel better and others feel worse. But at the end of the day, the thing that you put first in the workout is generally going to be the thing that is most productively trained and performed that day. So if you are emphasizing the heavy strength work in your program at this moment in time, then put the strength work first in the workout. But if you're emphasizing speed or power or explosiveness, then put the explosive exercises first in the workout. It's just kind of like that ends up being a pretty good general rule of thumb, even in spite of everything else that I've said today. And remember, there is no rule that says that you can't break movements up into different parts within the same workout either, like I talked about earlier. There's nothing that says you can't do the main part of your squats or pulls first in the workout, stop that exercise, move on to something different, some explosive drills, and then go back to the squat or the pull again after the explosive work, but this time using lighter weights and done for more total reps, for higher volumes. And so breaking the sequencing up that way, it kind of gives you the best of many of the different worlds. And that's why it's one of my favorite ways to split things up within a session. Basically, volume work on strength exercises is highly fatiguing. If performance is paramount, then whatever you need to perform well on should come before the volume work. The volume work can be done at a very high level after the heavy work or after the explosive work, but the explosive work and the heavy work cannot be done at a high level after the volume work. So if there's a single rule that needs to be adhered to in this sequencing game, that's really what it is. A lot of the rest of it can really just come down to personal preference and feel. A lot of which of that is just based on experience and time under the bar. Anyway, it's all I got for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you found it informative. I know all I really said here was how you do things just kind of depends, but I hope that you're able to take away some useful key points here to try out in your own training, and just that this video really gives you something to think about in terms of basically like the way things are supposed to be done versus other ways that they can be done just as effectively, if not more so sometimes. So please remember to smash the like button before you go. Leave me some love in the comments down below. Check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for online coaching and training programs. And keep training hard. I will catch you guys next time.